some late changes to the material based on the economic and public health situation that we're in now. So I presume that so I'll sort of present a lot of what I was going to do, and then with the modifications, and then I presume a lot of the Q&A will focus on how does this all look now given the situation. So let me take a second to get the slides going. Okay. How are those slides looking? Are they up and good? Okay. All right. See thumbs up. So so let me introduce myself. I'm Colin Jones from MassBudget and Policy Center. I'm the K-12 and early childhood analyst there. I've been at MassBudget for about 6 years at this point. So I've been paying attention and tracking this education reform process really for the last 6 years, and we were and are at a really exciting time for school reform. And so what I'm going to talk about is, you know, what is this new era of the Education Funding Bill, the Student Opportunity Act? What's in there? What's the main effects going to be? And then how does that change given the current situation? So first, I'll start with the budget process overall. You know, you know, there's different ways to think about the budget, and that we come from at our advocacy lens. There's this way where we have a 250-page PDF in legal language, which can be tough to work through. We have this version of the budget, which is a 2,500 line spreadsheet, which data people like myself are happy with, but it also can be pretty dense for folks. And then there's this version that MassBudget, we encourage folks to kind of think of it from this framework, which is that the budget is the state budget is the most important thing our state does every year. State government does. It reflects our values and what we want to do together, and it affects all of us. And so we want to start and sort of live at the values level. As policy wonks, we're also tempted to get right into, okay, here's what's going on in this line item and that line item, but we also want to make sure we keep the bigger picture in mind, and that's for education and everything else we're working on. So here's the regular budget process that I was going to review. So this is how it works in a normal year, and this is not a normal year, but let me go through that first, and then we can talk about it. So typically we would be waiting for, you know, we have the governor's budget in January, that went normally. Typically we'd be waiting for the House budget to be released in April. At this point, we do not know when that's coming. So they have basically said, the budget committees have been saying, you know, we don't know when the budget will come out, and for sure it will not be a normal budget process. So that is, you know, we're sort of in a holding pattern and figuring out how the Ways and Means chairs, Rep. Michaelwitz and I'm forgetting the Senate chair name at the time, but the Senate chair will go about this. I'm sorry, it's Michael Rodericks. They're going to have to figure out together, you know, how they're going to modify the normal budget process given the times. And so I think that makes us aware of the fact that, you know, given that often the budget is delayed anyway, they're not always getting it ready by July 1st, which is when they normally get it ready. So I think we should kind of brace ourselves for delays overall. And then typically in a delayed process, we would expect, you know, a continuation budget that would do 1/12 of the prior year's budget. We may not get that either, because if revenue is down from current levels, not even just from what we were projecting for 21, but actually goes below what we were getting in 20, it won't be sustainable to do an extension. So this is going to be a very interesting year. We're going to have the playbook's going to have to be kind of rethought given the situation, and obviously I'll talk more about this later. So right here's the education budget as it was proposed by Governor Baker. So this is kind of the starting point of where things may go. So the the dark blue chunk, the big Pac-Man eating almost the whole thing, that is the Chapter 78 amount. It's at 5.48 billion. And that was reflective of the governor's plan for the Student Opportunity Act, which I'll talk about. 1.6 billion roughly is teacher pensions. It actually shows up in the pension line items, but it's education related. About 1 billion is the MSBA School Building Authority. So kind of like with the T, there's a transfer of sales tax revenue to the MSBA, and the MSBA oversees school building projects, so cities apply to get funding. And we're in a world where a single high school has been 300 million or more. So if you have 1 billion for the entire MSBA, that kind of gets a sense of what that can do in these days and times. And so I know this is a Boston situation too, where simply put, there's just not the capital that they need, even in a normal situation. So and this orange slice here, that's every single other program. That's circuit breaker, charter schools, the administration of the department, the testing regime, every single other program is that little orange slice. So that's kind of, if you're sitting involved in the department, the amount that you have to actually work with, so much of it is formula driven. And even within this 800 million, a lot of it is, charter schools and circuit breaker and a bunch of programs that actually take up a lot of that 800. So I am a believer in working with DESE and seeing what you can do, but you have to kind of be realistic towards what they can work with. So as far as Chapter 70, it goes back to the Ed Reform Act of 1993 that set the baseline of how we do school funding in Massachusetts. And there was a lot that happened in the Ed Reform Act. As far as funding is concerned, we basically doubled state funding. This is just the growth in funding when you adjust for inflation. So an over $2 billion increase over the course of the late 90s. And I can say, as someone who was in school at that time, that we benefited from that act. There's a lot else that was also in there that related to MCAS and state standards and charter schools. But when it came to funding, it was a major change. So, however, if you look at the last 20 years, since the peak of 2002, Chapter 78, when you adjust for inflation, has been actually cut between 2002 and 2020 when you adjust for inflation. So that is the context in which a lot of our districts have been feeling, aid's not going up enough, costs are rising, student needs are rising, yet aid has been flat for a long time. And that's just not them imagining it. It's actually what's been happening. And so that's kind of the situation as we set out on this reform era. That, of course, now is impacted by the situation we're facing right now. So again, just to sort of say the state of play right now, I'm going to sort of walk you through the formula for these for two communities that I've picked, Worcester and Carlisle. Obviously, these are very different districts. They're sort of extremes with a second largest district or a third largest district, second largest city, Worcester, and then Carlisle, which is a K8, but one of our kind of suburban districts, and how the system works for these two different communities. So the first step in Chapter 70 is that we take all of the things that we need to do in education for teachers, administrators, operations, supplies, all those things, and then all the types of students we have. We can think of it as a grid. So all the things we need to spend in education and all the different types of students we have, and we add that all together into something called the foundation budget, which is basically the formula's estimate of what it takes to educate kids. And so on a per pupil basis, it's about 13,000 for Worcester, a little bit under 10,000 for Carlisle. And that reflects more English learners and low-income kids in Worcester, which is what you'd expect. And then the second step is based on the total wealth and income of those two communities, the formula determines how much each of them can contribute towards their total. So Worcester's about 3,600, Carlisle's almost 8,000. So they're just much greater per capita wealth and income in Carlisle and communities like Carlisle compared to Worcester. And then this is where it gets really progressive, where the formula is doing what we expect, where this gap between what a city can raise and what a city needs is filled in by Chapter 70 aid. So it's extremely progressive. So over 9,000 for Worcester, less than 2,000 for Carlisle. And so that's kind of the good stuff we have to build on from the Ed Reform Act of 1993. The challenges has been really, and this slide has been really similar for the last 10 years, is that the fourth step, unofficial step, is that districts can put in more money based on their local ability to do so, and it's a huge difference. So community like Carlisle and many of the other suburbs, like I live in Watertown, we're the same, are putting about over $10,000 in extra spending just based on their local ability and interest and capacity, whereas a community like Worcester is only putting an extra $135 per kid in based on their capacity, which is much less. And so this situation is very typical if you were to compare gateway cities to wealthier suburbs. So although our formula says they need 10 or 20% more funding, in practice they're getting 7,000 or 8,000 less for every kid in their classes. And so this raises a bunch of issues that the reforms that in the SOA we're trying to solve. So it's the equity issues. So we need to give more to the low-income communities who need more. It's absolutely not equitable, not the point of the system, for the most privileged kids to get the most and least privileged kids to get the least. And then there's the adequacy issue, which is if it really only costs $10,000 per kid to educate kids in Carlisle, which is what the foundation budget says, this is as of 2018, 2019, why are they spending double that? And the answer is 25 years on, the foundation budget no longer reflects what it takes to educate kids in the 21st century. So communities are rightfully saying we want to educate our kids, but then there's just this huge disparate capacity to raise revenue to do so. So that I could swap in any gateway city, any suburb, and we'd be in a situation. Boston is sort of unique because it's sort of in the middle of these communities. It has both low-income students and large amounts of local wealth and income to fund its schools. So it's sort of a unique animal. So we can talk about that in Q&A if you want. So not surprisingly, when you systematically give less resources to communities who need it the most, who also educate the vast majority of kids of color and low-income kids, and you systematically give them less resources, they're not performing at the same level. So this is just fourth grade NAEP scores, the 2019 NAEP test. We have major achievement gaps in fourth grade reading with higher income students, white and Asian students performing much higher than Black and Latino youth and low income youth. And so the light blue bar is the national average for all fourth graders. And so our Black and Latino and low income youth are performing worse than fourth graders nationally. Overall, we're doing better. And then with moderate high income folks, white folks, and Asian youth are also performing above the national average and the state average. So not a surprise, our tests like NAEP and MCAS, et cetera, will continue to kind of reflect the situation on the ground. So that was as it was, as things were, and then I'll talk about the Student Opportunity Act and we'll get into kind of what the world looks like now. So in November, SOA was signed into law. It reflects the first major reform since 1993. There were sort of small tweaks in the formula at different times, but this is really the sort of first wholesale opening of the formula. And then the current budget year that's being debated, so we're in FY 2020, the budget for 2021 is being worked on. So this will be, FY 21 will be the first year where the SOA will take effect. Overall, it was projected to add $1.5 billion to K-12 funding over the next 7 years. That's according to plans. Obviously, plans have changed now, or plans will change. That was going to be, almost all of it was going to be state aid to the districts, and then 90 million would be circuit breaker, so new special ed funding. And then about 10 million would be an innovation grant that or an innovation trust fund that DESE is going to administer, and would sort of be like an open grant program where districts and schools can apply for innovation grants. But obviously, 10 million out of 1.5 billion, it's obviously a small amount. So a little bit more about the special education piece of it. The plan is to add the costs that cities incur when they're transporting out of district special ed students who have the most severe needs to specialized schools, or what are called 766 schools. They're usually residential programs. Districts incur a lot of costs when transporting these students, and so the SOA adds the transportation costs of districts to the program, and the plan is to do it over 4 years. And then another part of it is to fully fund the charter reimbursements over 3 years, which is when kids go to charter schools, funding goes with them from the district, and so that program exists to make whole the districts because they're not saving. So if you're Worcester, for example, and you have 14,000 or so in school spending, all that 14,000 will go with a kid who goes to a charter school, and you will not be saving 14,000 when that kid leaves. You'll be sort of maybe having a few less kids in certain classrooms, but you're not saving anything like total average cost in the district. And so the charter reimbursement program is there to kind of help districts deal with that transition. So that's part of the SOA as well. As far as how the actual aid goes up, this was all part of the commission that came out in 2015. It said the biggest things we need to do are increase low-income funding, increase the increments for healthcare, special education, and ELL. So what you're basically doing is you're layering in the reforms in the SOA. You're inflating the whole formula every year, and then you're also hitting a target, which is in the bill itself. So both everything sort of the baseline and the targets get inflated each year, and then you're moving, again, according to the plan, 7 years. Within 7 years, you're moving towards those higher targets. So that's why you get to a kind of a cost that's 1.5 billion. So the low income rate will be the vast majority of this whole thing. So you have over 320,000 low-income kids across Massachusetts. So there's just more of them than some of the other groups. And then they're also highly concentrated in the districts like Worcester that get 80 or 90% of their funding from the state. So based on their concentration and just the numbers, it's going to be the biggest part of this. So SOA is doing something really huge, which is saying, when this thing is done, a low-income kid in the most low-income district is going to get double the funding of a typical student, and that's why up to about 9,000 in current dollars, but that will be sort of inflated as we go along. So that is the biggest cost in this thing. It's also like we're totally out in front of any state in the country. So like all the research says that if your goal is equal outcomes, even for kids who have faced much greater challenges in their lives, you absolutely need 100% or more extra funding, but basically no state is actually guaranteeing that. SOA is trying to do that. And as far as the counting process, that's another important part of this. So the plan in the SOA is to return to the standard old school 185% of federal poverty level threshold. And for this year, or for this coming year, the idea is to just use data that we had from 5 or 6 years ago. However, the department has to develop a new process for counting low-income kids for FY22 and beyond. And the interesting part about this is that you need both. And this is an area where MassBudget has had some disagreement with the governor and his team on this, where basically you need all of these things together. So you need definition of what a low-income kid is, which is what we have. You need a way to count them, which we have now and we're going to work on, and then you need to give them adequate support. Unless you do all three of those things, you're not actually getting where you need to go. And so that's an area that we're obviously paying a lot of attention to, again, pre everything that was going on now. So I'll say more about that in a little bit. So this is where we're going to be starting from when we sort of see how everything's being impacted by the public health and economic crunch that we're seeing right now. But Governor Baker's proposal was at $304 million. So year one of SOA, according to the governor, was going to be 304. That is basically double what we've been doing. So the average of the last 7 years has been about 144. However, we believe our belief at MassBudget was that we believe that they under accounted for the low income student increment, and that they would need another 70 million or so to actually do it in a way that's consistent and equitable and likely to be able to get the SOA done in 7 years. That is still our belief. We still believe that's the case, but we just have to adjust to the current situation with the budget in seeing how realistic that is. So in terms of what was going on, like I said, almost all of the areas of reform were funded 1/7 of the total in Governor Baker's budget. That led to this 304 million increase. Charters went up, circuit breaker went up, basically in line with meeting those parts of the SOA. And it, as you might expect, a lot of this 303, like over half of it went to gateway cities. So it's doing exactly what you'd expect. However, instead of doing 1/7 of the additions to low income to get to that, again, 9,000 per kid rate, that really high extra support for low income kids, instead of doing 1/7 of it, or 14%, they only did 4% or 1/25. And so that's where our view as researchers and on this is that that means that we're short 74 million again in the governor's proposal, which we're going to see if we can even sustain. So we still maintain that if you're going to do a 7-year phase-in of all of this plan, and you do only 1/25 of part of it, that does not meet. Again, after you do that for 7 years, you do less than 30% of it. So we did not really see a real discussion about how they would get from 4% in year 1 to 100% in year 7. So the argument, I'll give their side of it, and what they were saying basically was that, well, we're changing the counting process up to 185% of poverty. So that increase in the number of kids we're finding justifies slowing down the rate amount. However, again, we would say you need to do all these things right. You need to find the kids, you need to count the kids, and then you need to give them the adequate support that is all necessary to do this. The other point that's interesting is that, as I mentioned, the counting process for FY21, and it's in the SOA, it's not really able to be changed, is to do a temporary measure that uses data from 5 years ago. So the change in the low income count that they're basing this whole thing on is going to change next year. So the 22 counting process is up in the air. It's something to be worried about, I guess, because they have so many other things to worry about, but this has to be done ready for next year. So anyway, we don't like the idea of basing the slowing down of low-income increases, which are could affect the whole schedule of the bill, to base that on a one-time count increase. There's a challenge there. We can talk about that more in questions. So as far as special education, and I can say more about ELL, so I didn't have new material on ELL, which I can talk about, but as far as special ed kids, all the consensus of all the prior bills kind of came into the SOA. So the idea is assume that instead of basically increase the number of kids you are assuming are regular special ed students by about 1%. So that could add about 4,000 special ed kids to the formula. It's not, obviously underlying conditions on the ground are what they are, but we would just assume that there'd be about 4,000 more in district special ed kids under the SOA. And then the other big special ed change is to increase the provision or increase the rate for the kids who are in those specialized out-of-district placements. And the idea is to get it to about 3 times the statewide foundation budget, which is $31,000 in FY21. That was in Baker's proposal. So the idea is basically, if a kid, let's say a kid is an elementary special ed student, they'll get the elementary rate, and they're out-of-district special ed, they'll get the out-of-district special ed rate. Together, they'll get provided about 4 times the foundation budget. And that is also, as you folks who know this, that's also the cutoff where the circuit breaker program begins to provide extra funding. And so that's sort of the logic of that. So big picture about this, as many of you know, districts have special ed kids. They're required by federal law to provide them education in the least restrictive environment. These kids are there. They're already being provided services. So when the SOA increases the increments for them, it's not necessarily true that that is all going to be earmarked for special ed. So I think what it's basically doing is accounting for the spending folks know is happening. So I think this is kind of a live debate. Nothing says, and the way the foundation budget works, it's just guidelines. It says, here's what we think this is taking, but it's not binding the amounts of funding to the specific kids. I think there's some ways in which it's going to be more tightly bound for low income, like districts are going to have to report how they're using low income funding. I don't think there is a special ed component like that. So so I think it's going to be an interesting balancing act, because you can use some of the special ed increases, obviously should be, this depends on, I would sort of defer to people in the schools in terms of what's needed and what's going on, but you can use SOA money to fill in things that you've had to be pulling in from when special ed goes over what's accounted for in the foundation budget. So that's something to keep in mind. And then as far as the circuit breaker itself, one of the things that was going to happen, I give a lot of credit to Senator Lewis and Representative Peisch, who wrote the bill. One of the things that could have happened is, since the special ed circuit breaker is linked to 4 times the foundation budget, if you're increasing all the foundation budget areas in the bill, what could actually happen is districts would have less of their spending on special ed be eligible. So how they fixed that was they said, look, we'll take pretty much what it was in 20, which is about 46,000, was 4 times the foundation budget in FY20, and then we'll lock that in the bill, and so they'll just go up by whatever 2%, which is the normal inflation figure. So that will avoid the problem of less expenses being eligible for the circuit breaker. So good policy writing. I'm going to give them credit. So here's what happened again. I'll get into life after the coronavirus in a minute. But here's what we were going to do with what the governor proposed for year 1 of the SOA. It was exactly who you'd expect. So, Lawrence, Brockton, Springfield, Lynn, just the communities that need the most funding were getting the most funding in year 1. And then the state average was less than $1 million, and then Boston got only about $2 million. One more thing about Boston, but they got almost triple that in charter schools aid. So it's just a little bit more complex for them, where because of the wealth of the city and its massively high revenue and fast growing revenue, Chapter 70 is not designed to give a district like Boston a lot of new money. But the charter component and other components are going to kind of be a bigger deal for Boston. And then eventually, if you push up low income in all these other areas where Boston has a lot of these kids, you are going to get to a point where Boston gets more aid, but it just hasn't happened yet. It's just going to take a little bit longer into the reforms. So pre-coronavirus, how were you going to pay for this? So we were making a bet that revenue would be available for this. So there was no sort of specific new funding source that was, tied to this. And so it was going to be always, it was going to need kind of to take some revenue. And then again, it was sort of betting on the economy as it was. So that bet is looking, I think we would always expect that there was going to be a recession at some point, but we didn't expect it to be year 1, right? So we were this is pre-coronavirus. We were saying, look, there could be challenges here if you don't have enough revenue, which include like watering down the grant commitments on charter schools and circuit breaker, slowing the reforms or stretching them to beyond 7 years. We were kind of worried about that happening. And then all the other things that come up, like transportation, childcare, higher education, are all on the table too. So our basic point about this was, you know, our tax system right now is regressive in the sense that most people are paying about 9% of their total income in state and local taxes, whereas the top 1% who make around $700,000 a year or more are only paying about 7%. So we were going to need to address revenue and progressivity of revenue in order to do the SOA and to do everything else that we need to do. That's still true. So we do, you know, again, we have to reevaluate some of these in the light of the current context, but we do have the millionaire's tax or fair share amendment, which was coming, coming, or the discussion on it and the ballot question and constitutional amendment are still under discussion. There's income tax rate generally, excuse me. There's corporate taxes, which work on that is really going, where we have a lot of things where even large corporations are not necessarily paying their fair share. And then there's some areas of wealth taxes like capital gains, inheritance, estate tax, and high-end property transfers. If you're in Boston, this is relevant to you guys, that are potential areas of getting the revenue needed. So I'll close with what we do now, given the public health crisis, and then I can open it up for questions. Take a quick look at the clock here. Okay. So the FY21 budget process is right now sort of up in the air. We know we're not going to follow a typical process, and that's just, you know, we just can't. And so absolutely completing the SOA on time is at risk. And so I wish I could say how worried I am. I am worried about it. How difficult it's going to be depends on how much the write down of revenue is. So let's say it's like we're now going to get 500 million less in the FY21 budget. That's a big deal, right? Or if it's $1 billion, that becomes more difficult. So we are sort of in a holding pattern, looking to see what the Baker administration and the legislative budget writers are going to account for. And this, again, this is unlike any recession. Since it's so tied to the public health situation, it's hard to just say, oh, this is a standard downturn like 2008 or even extreme downturn like 2008. We just don't know how long, like everything's shut down. Casinos are shut down, restaurants are shut down, et cetera. That's all revenue that you'd normally get. And so we are kind of waiting to see what the picture is. And so it is kind of a tough situation. So if we're going to prevent cuts, we need to kind of look at everything across the board. So new revenue, like what areas of revenue are still possibly available even in a recession, like things like maybe there's normal activity that we have tax credits on that don't really make a lot of sense if we're really short on revenue. We have about $3.5 billion in the state's rainy day fund, so that's probably going to have to come into play. If the rainy day fund was designed for anything, I think, you know, global pandemic and recession has got to be one of the things that this stabilization fund was set up for. And then we should expect, as you all may have seen in the news, federal support's coming in some form. It's being debated as we speak. And so that's sort of like in 2008, where we were able to use stimulus funding and bailout funding to do things. So the other thing is that K-12 is important, but also we have these real high impact areas like unemployment insurance, healthcare, leave, and childcare that are rightfully moving to the front of the agenda with the coronavirus. So, so that's where I'll leave it. And I'm glad to take questions and again, focus more on, I wasn't able to cover everything. I know there's probably more questions about the current situation. Let me stop there.
How do you want us to ask the questions? Just call out. Can you hear me?
Just go ahead and ask questions. Thank you, Colin. I think we're going to open this up now and people can just ask questions. I don't think there's an easy way to moderate this. So just unmute yourself and ask your question.
This is Lisa Geisbon from Citizens for Public Schools. I was just wondering if you know if Baker in his budget had increased the low income increment by 1/7 instead of 1/14, like how much more would Boston have gotten?
So Boston, so it still was not going to change Boston's situation. So like, I think like of the 350 towns, Boston's revenue is like, and revenue growth is in the top like 10. So it just simply, you know, it wasn't going to be enough even with that change. However, I think the challenge for Boston is, and you can even ask the BPS budget folks, they get that this isn't going to help them in the first couple of years, but as you go higher and higher, as you phase in more of these reforms, you're eventually going to reach a tipping point where Boston does get new funding. But that is going to take a couple of years, and that's with a 7-year phase in. If you stretch out to 8 years, 9 years, what's going to happen is each year your contribution goes up by your revenue growth. And so if you're a high wealth, high revenue growth community like Boston, stretching at this out another year is going to be a major problem for you. So, and this is sort of the only other one I can think of that applies to is like Salem, where they have low income kids, but they have decently growing revenue. So Boston is obviously always special and unique. Keeping the grants funded, keeping charter schools funded, keeping the thing on schedule, that's kind of what's important for Boston. And then honestly, there always was going to have to be a conversation of how does the city find more of the revenue that's available at the city level. So like, I think I last looked at it, and Boston has over 1.6 billion in override capacity. So that's what it could tax locally under the 2.5 cap. And it just has to access some of that if it's going to do everything it wants to do for K-12 and early childhood and all the other areas housing. So it's just a conversation that has to happen somewhat at the local level given the profile of the city.
Hi, this is Edith Bazell. I have a question. On one of your slides, it says, and I quote, districts can use special ed funding to improve all programs. So I was just wondering, is that federally related to a cap? I know federally it's like 15%, but is that related to a certain percentage at all? Thank you.
Yeah, so the basic point is that the rates and sort of increments for special education, just like with every other foundation budget rate, are just kind of a model budget. They're not saying that, you know, the districts are not reporting back to the state and saying, yep, we got this exact amount in the formula for special ed, and here's how we're spending that exact amount. It's in a lockbox, that type of thing. It's a model budget, and then districts are spending from there. I think the situation so far, or recently in the last decade or so, has been special ed costs way more than what's accounted for, so people are just spending what they need to spend and pulling from different areas. So when you increase special ed rates, it's a little bit more complicated than just a one-for-one increase to special ed funding. But on the other hand, like, there's also the protections and the role of advocates in saying, you know, we need to make sure that this program is good. And I've said for a while, I wish I could spend a year just looking at, you know, what is actually needed in the special ed population that's not in those specialized schools. Like, you have to have a rate that accounts for a kid getting a little bit of attention or a little bit of pull-out time to all the way up to the edge of where they would be out of district placed. And so it's very hard for school finance to have a single rate structure that is enough for all those different range of needs. So I think it is a complex situation. It gets into budgeting at the local level and figuring out where the gaps are, and trying to use this period of, you know, again, planned, this increase in funding to kind of figure out how to optimize a lot of support for kids that is great for special ed kids and on kids in general.
Colin, this is Alice Wolf.
Hey, Alice.
How are you?
Good, holding up.
Okay, I have one comment on that last question, and then I have two questions for you. And my comment on the last question, I think you've tried to explain this, but it's for people who don't work with these formulas all the time. It's hard for people to understand that the formula, like for any particular community, when there's a certain amount set aside in the formula for special ed, it isn't actually counting up the kids who are getting special ed services in that community, and then giving them that amount of money. That I know you tried to explain this, but it doesn't always compute for people. That for special ed and ELL, it's just an estimate of what the average cost for a community is, and then that gets put into the formula, but the school system actually gets to spend what they start to spend. So my two questions are, one is, maybe it doesn't even make any difference anymore, but I've been interested in this. I know that MassBudget, during the time that the commission met to talk about the Chapter 70, the update of the Chapter 70 formula, MassBudget made an estimate that in order to really update the formula, the increased amount of overall dollars over the whatever the number of years is should be 2 or 2.1 billion. So my question on that is, I mean, like, we have what we have. The estimate was 1.5 billion that the legislature put out there, which is what the commission actually in the end recommended. What is your feeling about whether that overall sum was actually enough to try to compensate for the huge gaps we have between the poor districts and bring the poor districts up to par?
Yeah, well, let me start with the first part where this is some intricacies of the formula, but basically the assumptions, which are going to go up to 4% of traditional district enrollment, will be considered in-district special education and 5% of vocational. That is like 5% FTE. So in practice, if you look at just the DESE report, it's like, okay, there's 17% of kids are identified with some special need. So there is that kind of, there's a sort of formula building piece which says 4 to 5% of all kids will be full-time special ed. In practice, what's happening is that some kids are only getting 10 or 20% of their time in special ed, and then they're in regular classrooms for the rest of it. So there's that difference between, that's why that's so much lower in the formula assumptions compared to what it is in real life. So those are the kind of Chapter 70 intricacies that I can worry about, and happy to always talk about. And then as far as, is it enough? I mean, that's a great question. So, this, I didn't get into this, it was a good opportunity too. So as part of this, the state is expected to give 1.5 billion. That was the projection that the Baker administration came out with in October before the bill was done. And then it just so happens that they exactly did 1/7 of that in their budget. So that's clearly a model they're still working from. I have some challenge. I'm not exactly sure that they ever really fully accounted for the fact that you were both going to increase the amount for each low-income kid and you were going to increase the count. I'm not confident they ever really projected both of those things together, which is why I think there's this disagreement about whether they're doing low income properly. But the other thing that we can't forget is that cities' local contributions are going up too. So over that same period, cities' local contributions, what local communities have to do as their part of it, again, 60% roughly of the required school spending is local spending, and only about 40 plus, 41% or something is Chapter 78. So there's actually a greater increase in cities' local contributions. However, there's always a level of complexity here. Like I mentioned, for most communities, when I last looked at this, it was about 80%, and I'm gonna look at it again, given current data. But basically, we found that over 80% of districts were putting in extra local spending. So if, let's say you're Boston, you're putting in so much more above your requirement that when the SOA increases your local contribution requirement, all that will be done is extra funding will just be sort of mathematically reclassified as required spending. And so that is a complexity in the sense that there's communities for which, if you're Carlisle, you're not gonna have to contribute anymore, but some of that extra local spending will be classified as required, and facts on the ground don't really change. So that's why it's kind of the aid increase is very hard. It's like the state will increase by 1.5. The local contribution is real, but it may be on paper. A a couple of exceptions to that. So if you're a low income district, you haven't been spending a lot more than your requirement. And so the local spending increase is actually real. But if you're like Worcester, it's like, you know, you get like an 8-to-1 increase or something, some huge number. Like you're getting so much aid that giving a little bit more locally is not a big deal. It is something they have to kind of account for. And then if you're some of the rurals and small districts, declining enrollment districts, you don't have, like, some of them are very sort of, they're not much commercial property, there's not that much high-end property to tax, and you're expected to give more. And one of the challenges for those rurals is that you're not necessarily getting a lot more aid because you have declining enrollment. So for them, the SOA is not going to solve all of their issues. It's important for them that circuit breaker and charter schools be funded. You know, again, they're sort of like in a situation where you want to keep the whole timeline at 7 years, otherwise they'll have to pay more locally. So there are some complexities to this. The difference between the $2 billion that we was talking about years ago and the 1.5 now, I think a lot of that's explained by the role of locals in funding
Okay.
this.
Thank you. I have one more question. I think you would be helpful to some of the people on the call if you explained a little bit about the internal politics in the legislature around this funding. Specifically, as you were talking, I was thinking about, well, if you really need to get more money for some of these poor districts, you could take a little more money out of the health aid and put it into the low income aid, because health aid, the health care aid, is just distributes all across all the districts pretty much, and the low income is, but that of course is a huge political problem. So I think people who may not have a lot of experience would like to know about how some of these decisions have to be balanced in the legislature.
Yeah. So I think I'll talk about that and say a little bit about what the situation probably is now, given the coronavirus. So this thing took 6 years to get done, you know, and the biggest points of contention really were the extra funding for low-income kids. That was always that was the reason why it collapsed in 2018, because the House and Senate were in a different place on how much to do for low-income kids. And so this is challenging because basically you need, it needs to be focused on the places that need it the most, which the SOA is, because how much is there for low income. But it also needs to be like, it's very unrealistic for folks across the legislature to, you know, say, well, my district's getting nothing or getting cut and we're helping all the gateways. Like, it's going to be very difficult to make that case if you're a school committee member in one of the upper income or other places. Like, going back to your school committee and saying, you know, here's how we're going to not get any new money. That's also a challenge. So it's a balancing act, and that balance was struck very well with the SOA. So there's still going to be minimum aid. So there's a provision where basically no matter what, you generally get $30 extra in state aid for no matter what. Every year, and that is, it's not progressive, actually it's regressive. It basically says, if you weren't going to get any more aid because the fundamentals say you won't, here's $30. That's how minimum aid works. So that's still in there. I think that the inclusion of the special ed grants and charter school grants were also there because those kids are everywhere. So in terms of how to move forward, I mean, I think that pre-coronavirus, the conversation was, how do you, I mean, the way we were looking at it was, let's try to get to parity, where if you're doing special ed and healthcare and ELL students at 14%, do low income students also at 14%. I think it's still, that gets into a little bit of like, you know, in the bill itself, it says that we should be equitable and consistent with the phase-in. However, when you put words like equitable in a bill, people have different ideas of what equitable and consistent and equitable is. So that's one of the challenges there. So we were having that discussion pre-coronavirus, and we were saying, we think they should be at parity at 1/7 if we're really serious about getting this thing done in 7 years. It's just simply no one provided an answer about how you do 1/25 of the biggest part of it and then somehow finish it in 7 years. No one provided a good explanation, and there was sort of shifting words and stuff. So However, we are now in a situation where we kind of have to wait and see like how big the write down is, because it could be that if we're doing a write down of 500 million to $1 billion, doing what we even the amount that we said we were going to do in Baker's budget could be pretty hard. So, but it's still true that we should try to do these things equitably. We shouldn't leave the low-income kids behind, but it's just now we're in a different situation. And so the logistics of that are going to be really difficult. And, for instance, like if you say, well, we can no longer sustain 14% of these different areas, let's move everyone down to 10% or something. Well, then you're reshuffling the deck. Some people are getting less than they were in the first proposal, and that's not going to be very favorable to folks. I think people are going to be, but this is a unique set of circumstances too. So we're facing another recession, and so it's going to be pretty interesting in how we get through this.
Thank you.
Hi, this is Mike. I have a question. I was wondering if you could just explain again, I think you did, but maybe I didn't catch it. What was the method of counting low-income students for FY21 that resulted in the increase that our administration seems to have been reacting to?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So, we've been working on this low-income count issue really for the last 4 years. So, so just to back it up a little bit, the old school process was you basically said families fill out a form, at the district level, they filled out a form saying what their income was, monthly or weekly income, and then they filled out those forms and handed them back. And if you were 185%, basically up to 133, you're free lunch, and between 133 and 185, you're reduced price lunch. So 4 years ago, there was a good intentioned policy change at the federal level that said, you know what, if you have 40% or more low income kids or reduced price, let's just give free food to every kid, which is a good policy from food standpoint, more kids eating, less bureaucracy, et cetera. The problem was though that so many programs depend on an individualized count of who's low income and who's not. And so when you went to community eligibility, which was like a US, I think it was a USDA policy change that related to the school food program, you all of a sudden didn't have an individualized count of who was low income and who was not. And so every state was basically in a situation of, okay, now we got to figure out how to count. So we did, so that was the old school system. The new school system, or that was up until the SOA, was, okay, we're going to count kids who are in foster care, DCF, food stamps, mass health, and some other categories. We'll consider them eligible for free lunch. However, the problem with that is there's a lot of non-citizens or people who are either not eligible for programs or not signing up. So like you could be poor, you could have less than 185% of poverty, but if you don't participate in one of those programs, you wouldn't count. Then there was just bureaucratic problems. There was citizenship issues where you're not eligible as a non-citizen. I mean, well, there's mixed status families where maybe a kid is a U.S. citizen, but their parents are not. And then in the current era, in Trump era, they have credible reason to be worried that this is going to hurt them for immigration reasons. So we have been trying to solve that issue for the last 4 years, and it's been a lot of ups and downs. And so the way the SOA settled that was for 21, it just said, use the old school system, which is under the higher system. And that caused, about 40,000 more kids to be identified in 21. But that data is now really, really old. It's like, it was based on 2016, and even that was based on a few years ago. So that's less and less accurate. So that was the increase. And so that's why we were concerned, like there's certain communities that it looks like on paper in the FY21 proposal that they're getting a lot more, like you're identifying all these more kids. But the bill says in FY22, it'll be a new process. So those kids could just disappear. And next year, then you're like, districts will get whiplash again about like, wait, I thought we identified all these kids. So, so that's why we were kind of, I mean, there was like a working group with the department and school leaders and whatever to figure out what the counting process will be in 22 and beyond. We haven't met for months, even before coronavirus. So that's supposed to be figured out by November and then used in in the FY22 budget process, but that's something to keep an eye on. Basically, the gist of it is you need something for kids who do not meet any of those other thresholds, either their families are not participating or not eligible. We were talking about a sort of supplementary income form that districts can kind of use like the old school form was used. And we were having a back and forth with Desi about like, is that auditable? And like if you use this gets a little bit down the rabbit hole, but at the federal level, the auditing process for school meal forms is very intensive, such that like a certain percentage of them are like followed up with really detailed checking on their income and whatever, and that would be an impediment probably to non-citizen families in this environment. So we need a state, probably what we need is a state form for supplementary income that is reliable, that we do some auditing on to make sure it's not just bogus, but not so intrusive as to kind of scare families away. So that's something that we'll have to attend to. MassBudget's worried about it, but you know, there's a lot of other things going on, so we'll have to just keep an eye on it.
So just to summarize and make sure I'm understanding, MassBudget would favor going back to actually looking at family household income, but using a process that's less intrusive than the federal lunch program process.
Yeah, so we were sort of mixed. Like a lot of people were really upset when they switched from the paper count old school system to what's called direct certification. If you're in Mass Health, food stamps, DCF, whatever, you just count as low income. We're okay with that process, but we just need a supplement for the kids who aren't counted, but who are low income. So like in 2017, when they made the switch, all of a sudden like 70,000 kids disappeared. Well, those kids were still obviously at the schools. It's just we weren't counting them. So we sort of were okay with direct certification, but we just need some other supplement to allow those families who aren't participating or for whatever reason to be counted, because again, we have to serve kids regardless of immigration status at our schools. So we need some way to count low-income kids regardless of immigration status as part of this. So we were hopefully, you know, we get there. I think we're coming up against, we're planning to go to 2. So we have time for more questions if folks have them.
If you have the time, Colin, that's.
Yeah, I'm okay up for another 15 or 20 minutes. We may have covered everything.
Let's see if people have questions. Do people have additional questions?
This is Lisa Geisbund again. Can you talk a little more about the potential for federal aid to help us with this?
Yeah, that's the billions of dollar, $1 trillion question. So, in 2008, there was federal stimulus package that was putting, I think in the like mid hundreds of million, 400 or 500 million, into school aid. Like we were able to use what's called ERA funds to prevent cuts in Chapter 78. This is a rapidly evolving situation. So, they haven't, I think where is it at now? So the Senate is haggling. There's a negotiation between Schumer, Pelosi, the White House, and Mitch McConnell to try to finalize the third, I think, coronavirus package. So, it's just, we got to just see what's in there. So I think, as I mentioned, I think there's going to be a big focus on unemployment insurance, healthcare, childcare, obviously the frontline response. And then what will happen with state budget support is kind of up in the air. So, I mean, obviously it'd be preferable if everything included, like every state is going through this, where especially the states that, if you're all sales tax or something and people are staying at home, you're facing a huge hit. So hopefully, and this is just an advocacy piece, that hopefully governors and other folks are advocating for relief from the feds, but we just kind of have to wait and see the details. I mean, I think as far as education is concerned, it's so there'd be one thing if we're saying, okay, the 21 budget, we have to write down the revenue that's available. That would be a challenge. It could, I mean, the worst scenario is this is so bad that we have to write down the 20 budget that we're in the middle of, and we have to start doing 9C cuts. That would be a more extreme scenario. I don't think that would happen to like districts. Like you're not going to. I don't think that there's any precedent or likelihood of clawing back people's Chapter 70 aid. I don't think that's going to they're going to go there. But I don't want to also preclude it. So if we had federal stimulus money, that would help us not do that. And I think we have to think about, and like I said, we have to look at all the options on the table. So is there new revenue, particularly new revenue that's, if it's like wealth-based and people still have wealth, they just don't have as much income or something, that might be more favorable. Or things like, well, we have tax breaks that are helping out corporations that don't really make a lot of sense. Can we look at those? Because even if they have less activity and pay less taxes, they, people paying taxes on more of what they're doing would help us. So yeah, this is a kind of difficult one to predict. I think in K-12, I think is a little bit more solid, but we'll see. I think higher ed's interesting because theoretically what we should be doing is a lot of kids now have paid a lot of fees on things they're not actually getting, and schools have shut down. They've gone remote. So like you're still paying tuition, but maybe you paid room and board, but you're not even getting room and board. So there's that issue. But if that is refunded, then you're actually destabilizing the bottom line of those campuses. And so unless you there has to be kind of a combination of federal and state support to allow that to happen without disrupting things. And then childcare is the most immediate one because, doctors and nurses and, folks at groceries and first responders and whatever essential workers need childcare, but the childcare sector is shut down. So I can say this as a parent, we're in a situation where we're going to pay for services we're not getting, and not everyone can do that. And that's sort of a live issue. So I think childcare probably among all the three parts of education is the most urgent to figure out how do we keep the sector alive or afloat, like centers can't sustain with no income and continue to pay their staff. And these are already centers that are operating on very thin margins. So they could kind of like many childcare centers are on the edge even in normal times. So I think that like Catherine Clark and Joe Kennedy, for instance, are working a lot on including a part of this for childcare where hopefully it's money that like the state can use. I mean, the emergency childcare program that the state is just putting together is free of charge and is all state funded. But again, we have the ammunition that we need is the revenue. So, so I project that, I mean, again, it's a rapidly evolving situation, but we're going to use a combination of seeing if there's new revenue or anything on the table that's out there, using the rainy day fund and using federal funds to kind of keep this thing going.
Thank you.
Somebody's got to have another question so we don't end on that cheery note.
Oh no.
I actually do, which is just sort of a technical question. When you were talking about the circuit breaker, the $90 million in additional funding for the circuit breaker that's intended, you referred to them as circuit breaker grants, and maybe this just reflects my not understanding the terminology, but is there anything different, like applying for a grant that districts have to do to access this money, or is this just going to be accessed the same way they always access circuit breaker?
Oh yeah, sorry. It's taking another cost that districts are incurring and making it part of this already existing process of you report your eligible expenses, which are expenses for out of district special ed above 4 times the foundation, and then you get it. So it's the same process, but it's just saying, this new amount of this other cost you're incurring for transit is also included in that process. And again, we were on track to do 1/4 of it, or on track for getting it done in 4 years. Then coronavirus hit, so we have to kind of, I think, like Chapter 70, you'd want to, the probably, again, this is sort of projecting, but depending on how big the write down is, even getting what we said we were going to do in Chapter 70 might be a stretch. So that's kind of a starting point. And then same goes for charter schools and circuit breaker, where they're pretty big grants, pretty big programs. Holding the line on them might be the best case scenario, given the situation.
I have one other one if nobody else does. I don't want to monopolize, but
Go ahead.
okay. So this may go beyond, this goes beyond the money and therefore may or may not be something that you can answer. But so the part of the SOA that's about these 3-year plans that the districts have to file, you know, telling how they're going to evidence-based practices to make this money reduce achievement gaps. One, do you know that whether or not the original deadline of April 1st for the submission of those plans to the department is going to be extended?
Oh,
And
that's going to be extended. That's
I
gonna be
assume so, but
extended,
okay, great. And has there been any discussion of when those will be?
Yeah, so I think that there's a series of kind of state response packages that are kind of moving in parallel to the federal response packages. I mean, so they're, you know, they're all moving. So I think like they're doing things like they're postponing special elections. They're reducing the requirements of signature gathering. They're doing all these different things. They're doing like remote, like town meetings to be remote. They're doing all these kind of immediate things to respond to coronavirus. So I think like in the big scheme of things, they're doing things on like regs and like what nurses can do and what retired medical staff can do. So obviously those type of frontline things are a priority. Further down the priority list though is like the normal business stuff that, or, you know, that were like these 3-year plans. So I think that I have to look and see, but I'm sure some, you know, whatever, phase 3, phase 4 type of response bill will say that these plan deadlines will move back to exactly when, we'll see. There's also, as many of you probably know, there's a push to now the feds have said that you can waive the state testing requirement for MCAS this year. I think it makes, I mean, already we're, you know, the MCAS schedule, even if you wanted to do it, is going to be kind of impossible given that, you know, how much time kids are out of school. So that's in play too. But just as Commissioner Riley said, like there's, you know, even though the feds have said there's a waiver possibility, you need to, the state needs to pass state law to complement that to actually result in a waiving of MCAS. And so anyway, I would say that stuff like that plan and other things, MCAS and other things like that, graduation requirements in higher ed, that type of stuff, will be part of the kind of 4th or 5th level. It is important. It needs to be attended to. I don't think anyone opposes it. It's just, we just got to get to it and see the details.
And finally, I think this is my last one. Thank you. Those plans, I sort of think of them as being like the bargain. Like if you're going to get the 1.4 billion, you've got to do these plans to show how you're going to make the money work. Is it literally all districts that have to do the plan, or just those that are going to benefit from the increase in state aid?
Yeah, so before all this happened, they were starting to kind of roll out the regs for this. But basically, if you were a district that was getting like a small amount of money, you had to do like a shorter form. But if you were a district like I said, like, you know, there was like all the gateways were getting, you know, 15, 20 million just in year one, even without low income fully done. So those were large amounts of money. So those districts were going to be doing what was called the long form. So they're going to have to say a little bit more about their plans. And then this is kind of like, again, pre-coronavirus, this is like we were building the plane as we were flying it. So we had never done it before. And even before all of this, April 1 was kind of an ambitious deadline. But I think the argument was, well, the funding's coming, so let's start the plans going as well. You know, I think it was going to be interesting because basically you were going to have to report, like they had a calculation that said how much of this new money would have happened anyway, like normal growth and inflation, and then what was new related to the SOA. And so if you were like a gateway, a lot more of it was like low income or ELL or whatever. So so the plans were based on how much was new money, and that calculation, that was all new. So my thinking was, and it seemed to make sense, that, I mean, it's good to, you know, if done right, it was not super prescriptive. Like it was not like, you know, I think that there was a critique like, oh, this is too many strings. Well, I hear that, but also like the accountability structure in place, like MCAS and the Achievement Gap Act of 2010 and ESSA, which is what replaced No Child Left Behind, that was all there. And so the state was kind of trying to, I think, or the SOA was trying to say, okay, let's have a rational planning process. Let's have community input. Let's do all these things to kind of allow districts to, and the public to know what this new money is being spent on. That was never going to be like the harshest kind of strings. And there was a lot of things to be interpreted about, like, well, what would happen if the commissioner said a plan wasn't good enough or something like that. But it seems like it's sort of a middle ground, and it could be an entry point for community members. Like, there was a requirement that you had to have open meetings and discussions with community stakeholders and stuff. So so anyway, this was pre-coronavirus. Now all that's going to be pushed back. It's still reasonable. I think, like, again, it was always part of the bargain in a sense that, yeah, let's have a coherent plan about what we're going to do. That's fine. And the list of things that was acceptable in the plans was almost anything, right? So, like, after school or emotional support programs or ELL programs. I mean, just about anything could be part of your plan. So I think it was reasonably balanced, but again, it's all up in the air now, and we'll see what happens. Maybe it'll be like by July or something. I'm not sure.
But there will be regs that specify it's
Yeah, they're already working
the
on the
short
regs.
form and the long form and who has to do what.
Yeah, so already on DESI's website, there's the regs about short form, long form, instructions for districts. Their website's sometimes up and down, but it's in terms of readability, but it's already up there somewhere. So I've looked at it, I can dig it up, but it's up there already. And then of course they'll modify them post coronavirus.
Colin, I see that the giraffe on the wall behind you is starting to droop a little bit. So maybe it's time.
Yeah, we're coming from my son's playroom, so.
Thank you very much. And
Yeah.
thanks to everybody who participated. This has been great, Colin. I hope we can have another conversation when it's a little clearer what the actual coronavirus budgetary implications are. But this has been great. Thank you very
Yeah,
much.
thanks everyone, and
Thank you so much.
We're
Thank
still
you.
on the case. We're trying to figure out as an organization how to respond to everything that's going on, and we all the help that we can get from you guys in terms of letting us know where the priorities are. We're going to try to keep the longer term stuff in view as well as just responding to the immediate as well. So hope everyone is handling it okay and is safe out there, and hopefully we'll be back to something more like normal within a month or so, and or we'll just we'll figure it out. We'll adapt and do what we need to do.
Thank you very, very
All right.
much.
All right, thanks everyone.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye, everyone. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Stay well.